No, they've got very, very happy to be welcoming Andrew Adonis. As most of you know, I'm sure, he's an academic, he's a writer, he's a journalist, and of course a politician. He was active as the policy unit head in Tony Blair's government. He was Minister for Education, Minister for Transport, and then, having gone into the House of Lords, he was Secretary of State for Transport. And in the Lords now and in the Labour Party, he's a very active and influential advocate for Remain and the people's vote. So we're delighted to hear his up-to-date thinking on where we stand. Thank you.
Is that loud and clear? Can you hear me? Can you hear me loud and clear? Good. Look, it's great to be here this evening. Can we first of all give a big hand for the Suffolk EU Alliance, who've done fantastic work in organising this meeting and also organising the coaches. Going to the two big rallies we've had so far, and the next big one, which is going to be at the beginning of October, where we want to be more than 1 million this time. How many of you are going to be there at the beginning of October? That's great. There are a few of you who are not. Well, please rearrange your diaries and bring your 50 closest friends along too. What we've got to do is that Boris Johnson has got to be under no illusions at all that the majority of this country want a referendum, they want to remain, and they are not prepared to have this catastrophic decision foisted on them without an opportunity, because we're a democracy, of voicing our view as to what should happen. And we can only do that. Really big demonstration at the beginning of October, so that's great. It's also great to be here at the University of Suffolk. I love the piece of sculpture outside with the big question mark, but we know what the answer is, don't we? No to Brexit. It's not a question mark, we've got the answer. But that's great. I love Ipswich too. I've been campaigning here many times over the years. The last time I was here campaigning was with my good friend Chris Moll, who it's so great to see here today, when he was MP for Ipswich, and we were fellow transport ministers together. This was in the pre-grailing era, when the trains used to run on time. Indeed, as I said to Boris when I saw him recently, the one thing, even at the moment, because you know this gathering here this evening is already larger than the membership of the Conservative Party who's going to choose the next Prime Minister, so he has a slight problem once he's become Prime Minister. Now I've got to unite the country beyond. I said the one thing that he could do to unite the country, even in this great extremity, is not to appoint Chris Grayling as Transport Minister, so we could actually move to a new era when our transport systems run and when we don't have the... do you remember the ferries, that the ferry company that doesn't have any ferries?
No ferries, no port.
And so it goes on. But in those days, we did great things. And though I'm very glad that there are people from all parties and no parties who are here, and that's important because this is a big alliance of the people which we're engaged in at the moment. I do think that our politics as a country divides into pre-Brexit and post-Brexit in this respect, that when Chris and I were in government, and there are other people who have been engaged in politics for many years, including, I know because Chris was a leader of Suffolk County Council, wasn't it, before, and there were lots of you who were engaged in local politics too. Whatever the political party we were in, whether it was Lib Dem, Labour, Conservative or Green, I doubt there are many people who are UKIP here, but maybe there are one or two who are there too. What we all sought to do before Brexit, we spent all our time trying to do, was to improve the state of the country. Yep. You know, we had somewhat different views as to how to do it, but we did not go about systematically trashing and undermining the country. What is happening now with Brexit is a systematic trashing and undermining of the country. And watching Farage yesterday welcoming the resignation of Britain's ambassador to the United States on the grounds that he had not been sufficiently fawning to the president of the US, who is Donald Trump, is one of the most disgraceful moments in my political life. You need to join the dots on these things. Did you see Trump's tweet 6 months ago? I wish that Farage was Britain's ambassador to the US. He now seems to think he can choose. I mean, he seems on his way to choosing how our Prime Minister is going to be. He wants to choose who the ambassador is going to be. He seems to think he can virtually choose who the Queen is. I mean, the thing is an absolute and complete disgrace, but it goes to the heart of this Brexit issue, which is that it is far from taking back control, which is what we were told.
Yeah.
It's giving, who are we giving control to? To Farage, to Putin, to Trump. You need to look at all of the people who want Brexit. Who are the people who are keenest on Brexit out there? Trump, Putin, Salvini, Orban. Is those the people that we want determining the future of this country and our international alliances in the period hereafter? You just need to join the dots on this and to see quite what a crazy thing Brexit is. But it's not just what Brexit actually stands for, which is basically a kind of advanced nationalist spasm which was sold on the basis that it would deliver a whole lot of undeliverable things. It was going to be everything that you ever wanted. Remember the bus, 350 million on the side of the bus, which we were going to get back. A whole lot of things that can't be delivered. But we're now beginning to realise, and I feel this really deeply in Parliament at the moment, the opportunity cost of Brexit. Because the only thing that Brexit is doing, the only thing that Parliament is doing at the moment is Brexit. Literally every day. We're debating Brexit bills, Brexit resolutions. For the best part of a year, every day when I came into the House of Lords, there would be 10 or 15 of what we'll call these no-deal regulations, which were the regulations as to what should happen when there were no ferries going through the ports, reintroducing international driving licences, working out what's going to happen to the transportation of human organs when we no longer have the ports and the airports operate. I mean, unbelievable things which we were doing day after day. What we should be doing, and what the message should be from us and the big rally at the beginning of October, is what is it that we need sorting out in this country? We need a better NHS, we need a better education system, we need public services that work, we need to deal with the housing crisis, we need to deal with all of these issues facing the country, and not a Brexit that will make it harder for us to tackle all of them and bankrupt the country so we've got no money to engage in it in the first place. And it's high time we got back as a country to dealing with the problems facing the country and not the nationalist fantasies of Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And if we can get the debate focused on that over the next 3 months, I'm absolutely convinced that we can win this Brexit issue, put it behind us and move towards a referendum, which I think is now the only way of dealing with this issue. As we go into the 4th year after Brexit, I mean, there's a longer interval now between the last 2 general elections than between the last Brexit referendum and now. As we go into this, we go into the 3rd Prime Minister. You know, Brexit is the revolution that devours its children, or, you know, if you want to mix your metaphors, it's the 3rd rail of British politics. If you touch it, you're dead. We're the 3rd Prime Minister, since... So all of my metaphors are transport metaphors, I'm really sorry. The 3rd Prime Minister since Brexit. It destroyed Cameron, it destroyed Theresa May, it will destroy Boris Johnson unless... It will destroy Boris Johnson unless he doesn't do Brexit.
Yeah.
And allows himself to be defeated on a referendum and then the referendum goes the wrong way. He is absolutely capable of doing that, because the crucial thing to understand is Boris doesn't believe in Brexit. He doesn't believe in anything except Boris Johnson. He is the Roman emperor for whom policy, which is the sort of thing that many of us have spent our life thinking is quite important, none of that matters. You know, he's a rich Etonian, and you know, for whom life has been very, very favourable. The only thing that matters to Boris Johnson is that Boris Johnson is the emperor. Policy is bread and circuses. You can have Brexit, you can not have Brexit, you can have a cable car, you can have a new design of a bus. As long as it glorifies Boris, it's absolutely fine. This is the guy who, remember when he came out for what was supposed to be a great cause of principle, wrote 2 articles in the Daily Telegraph. There's the one that was published as to why it was so imperative to take back control and save our national honour and to be the new Churchill and to stop the rout of Dunkirk that we had to do Brexit. But on the same day, he wrote the article as to why we should stay in the European Union. And why should we stay in the European Union? He told us because we owed it to the next generation. I'm glad to see there's some young people who are here this evening. We owed it to the young people that they could be able to travel, live, travel, love, which matters a lot to Boris,
It
do
does.
all of these things freely across Europe without needing visas and without having impediments, that we needed to safeguard our trade, and that was important. And crucially, he said, we must not give in to the shirtless Putin, he said, who will be strutting around the world if Britain leaves the EU because Europe will be divided. Well, the shirtless Putin has indeed been strutting around the world. Indeed, it's him who's been responsible for a lot of our most serious security threats that we face as a country. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, by the way, if we don't find that the Russian state wasn't behind the leak of the secret telegrams from the embassy in Washington. It will be completely in line with what's happening at the moment. Now, that is the Johnson that I agree with, the one that wrote the article which was 100, diametrically opposed to the cause that he followed. He is, and indeed, if are there any subscribers to the New European here today? Do subscribe, it's great, because their star columnist, who has his column on page 2, which is your guest lecturer this evening. I have done 2 columns by my great friend Jeremy Corbyn, for and against Brexit, and the 2 different Jeremys that there are in terms of his views. But I say that the Jeremy who is winning through without any doubt at all is the one against Brexit. And why? Because it's not actually possible to marry a prospectus for this country which involves more security, more prosperity, and more partnership with our European friends and allies. It's not possible to chart a course for those things which involves leaving the European Union. The only way of doing it is to stay. Now, the truth is, of course, that the Brexiters sort of understand this, because their arguments are completely flimsy and completely collapse every time you try to engage. I have spent longer in TV and radio studios with Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage over the last 18 months debating Brexit than with members of my own family. You can guess how delightful I find that experience. But I've now got into, because the way of dealing with them is constantly to meet fiction, because this whole Brexit thing is based on that's a brilliant arrangement. I wish the rest of the United Kingdom could do the same. I mean, the problem it's seeking a solution to, which is how do you safeguard your trade whilst leaving the EU? The obvious answer to it is not to leave the EU. It's not a complicated issue, this. It's a simple issue. And the government came to the conclusion quite early on that it had to do that in respect of Northern Ireland, because you had an added issue in Northern Ireland, not just the tariffs and all the problems of border arrangements, but you had their Good Friday Agreement and the potential of a breakdown of peace in Northern Ireland, because as soon as you have a hard border, as the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland said, if you have a hard border, you'll have smuggling. The smuggling will be run by the paramilitaries.
Yep.
That is precisely what happened in the 1960s and 70s, and was a big part of the Troubles, including one of the first things that happened when the Troubles broke out was shooting and firing on border control posts. And that this would obviously be extremely dangerous. I mean, anyone who goes, as I do a lot at the moment because of Brexit, to Northern Ireland, this idea that we've got a stable situation in Northern Ireland, we're now into the 3rd year of no devolved administration in Northern Ireland at all. Bombs are going off in Northern Ireland, there are terrorist outrages happening today, the paramilitary groups have been splintering, it's very, very dangerous. And the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who is not political entirely, said the single biggest threat to the peace and security of Northern Ireland was Brexit, because of the risk of what would happen when the paramilitaries get control of the smuggling, which is the reason why the EU insisted on the backstop, and the reason, crucially, why Theresa May agreed it. The thing is, of course, once she agreed it, Jacob Rees-Mogg and the ERG, which, as you know, stands for Economic Ruin Group,
Yes.
they, alongside the DUP, wised up quite quickly to the fact that if you're going to have no border arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, because essentially Northern Ireland is staying in the EU, then the logic is you're going to have border arrangements down the Irish Sea, which of course is true. That would necessarily have followed. And they didn't want that. Well, I have an answer to that one too. If you don't want border arrangements down the Irish Sea and Northern Ireland is going to stay in the customs union, stay in the single market and have a backstop, then I'm all in favour of the backstop applying to the entire United Kingdom. Indeed, my proposal at the time, which I said to Theresa May when I saw her, is why don't you have a backstop that lasts for 500 years, and then we've got no problem at all, and we can all go away and not have to worry about it. But of course they did worry about it, and that's the reason why they rejected her deal. By the way, this was always going to be a problem. John Major and Tony Blair, who were responsible for bringing peace to Northern Ireland, by the way, this is the single best thing that the British state has done over the last 25 years, is peace in Northern Ireland, started by John Major, finished by Tony Blair, with very close working with a succession of Taoiseachs of Ireland too. It was a phenomenal success. They warned then that it wasn't going to be possible, because of course the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom went into the EU at the same time, and they did it not least to see that we wouldn't be out of sync in terms of our customs and trade arrangements. So it was always going to be a problem. What the Brexiters said is there'll be no problem. They said they were sort of daring the EU to erect border controls, as if somehow there was any choice about the matter. Of course there's no choice. If you've got different customs, trade and immigration rules, you have to have border controls. It's just a matter of fact. It doesn't matter whether you call them hard or soft border controls, whether you actually have watchtowers and barriers and all of that, or whether you just have loads of police and customs officials who start stopping trucks and cars at random and frequently, as you need to do if there's going to be smuggling. It has to happen. There's no choice about it at all. So all of those problems came home to roost. But what is it that the Brexiters said could happen instead? Because they didn't like Theresa May's backstop. So what did they say could happen? Well, they said that we could have a new backstop, they said. The new backstop would be time limited. Well, you know, our friends in Dublin, they wised up quite quickly to the fact that a time-limited backstop isn't a backstop. No. They said that we, the United Kingdom, could have the right to withdraw from it unilaterally, they said. Well, that's not much of a backstop either, is it? So what they then said is it could all be in the cloud, that it could all happen electronically, that somehow we'd all be able to do it by some satellite that would somehow spot everybody moving across the border and presumably would send them tariff bills and ban them from moving if they were breaking immigration rules by zapping them from on high or something. Well, that was clearly going to be impossible. So what Theresa May said then, when she was trying to get Parliament to agree her deal the second time on this issue of the backstop, is that what we would seek was alternative arrangements. She said, alternative arrangements to the backstop. Well, this is where it becomes positively Orwellian. There were no alternative arrangements. So what then happened when she needed to say that there was work going on in alternative arrangements? She set up an alternative arrangements working group. This is where it becomes really Orwellian. Except that the alternative arrangements working group met for 6 months and never produced a single alternative arrangement. So I then started saying to my good friends Jacob and Nigel when I was in them, well, what are your alternative arrangements? You don't like her backstop. You've been voting against that and saying it undermines British sovereignty and is incompatible with Brexit. So what is your alternative arrangement? And I finally nailed Jacob when he said, well, I tell you what should happen, he said, in Northern Ireland. I tell you what should happen. Ireland should also leave the European Union.
Fat chance. No way.
Now, there is a logic to this. Do you understand the logic? If Ireland leaves the European Union at the same time as the United Kingdom, and it writes a blank cheque, those of us of a certain age still remember what these things called cheques were, it writes a blank cheque that it will agree to implement whatever trade, immigration and tariff rules Boris Johnson and Jacob or whoever is going to be running this country over the next few years agree with the EU. It does all of that, it gives up its sovereignty in advance, and it agrees to whatever other arrangements Britain is going to be put in place, then it is true, you do not need a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, that's true. It still leaves Ireland with a nightmare in terms of its relations with the EU, because there's still going to be a border then in terms of its trade with the EU, but it means there isn't a border in Northern Ireland. But have you spotted the obvious problem in this arrangement? There is a reason why this country is called the Republic of Ireland. It has a lot to do with Jacob's ancestors. It was the 4 or 5 centuries when we tried to rule Ireland as a colony. And I said, Jacob, it didn't work then. Why do you think it's going to work now? And it would be funny if it weren't so literally, deadly serious. The idea we should start treating Ireland now in the way that Oliver Cromwell was treating Ireland in the 17th century is utterly, utterly shameful and has led to a breakdown in relations between Britain and Ireland on a scale that we have not seen since we both joined the European Union in the 1970s. It is absolutely juvenile student union politics, or Oxford Union politics, whatever you want to say, because that's where they all were, or Eton pot politics, because we're just about to get another Etonian Prime Minister, and this is all basically about who should be head boy of Eton. I mean, it is utterly juvenile if it weren't so serious. And as you go down the list of issues, this is what it's like issue by issue. That's Ireland. What about these trade deals? Do you remember all of these trade deals that were going to be signed by Liam Fox a minute after we leave the EU?
Load of rubbish.
Except we haven't had a single one yet. We've had a few trade continuity deals, which are just existing deals rolled over. But even they've been with the smaller members of the international community, not the larger ones. I mean, the biggest one so far, I understand, is with the Faroe Islands.
Yes.
Now,
really
my geography isn't great. I got out my atlas and looked up the Faroe Islands. And in particular, I looked up its population. It's 50,000. It's half the size of the Isle of Wight. So what is the prospectus of Brexit with our trade? That we should replace the trade of France, Ireland, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and so the list goes down, with the Faroe Islands. I mean, it would be utterly, utterly ridiculous if it weren't actually the policy of Her Majesty's government. And you could, on the trade thing, it gets worse and worse. Not only are there no trade deals that have been negotiated, but this greater, do you remember the global Britain we were all hemmed in by only having an association with our 28 nearest neighbours that happened to include half our trade, Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, and so on. This was supposedly holding us back. But actually, this European Union, which was supposedly turning its back on the world, is the single best negotiator of free trade agreements across the world that there has ever been in human history. It has 53 trade deals with 73 countries. It's just agreed one with most of Latin America, which is great news because my friend Jeremy, he loves Latin America, so now he knows that we're going to be able to trade with it more freely. It's made him distinctly more pro-European. Because Jeremy's big problem with Europe is that it's not a Latin American liberation movement. So now that he can see that the EU has negotiated a free trade agreement with his beloved Latin America, we're now a long way to moving my party's position on it. But it's the EU that has a trade agreement with it. The EU signed a trade agreement with Japan last year. Yep. The EU has just signed a trade agreement last week with Vietnam. So the list goes on. The ones it doesn't have a trade agreement with so far, which is true, is it does not yet have trade agreements with China and the United States. That is true. We have spent the best part of 15 years trying to negotiate a trade agreement with the United States. The reason we don't have a trade agreement with the United States isn't because we haven't tried hard enough. It's because we're not so craven that we're prepared to give in to everything which Trump wants, which would trash environmental protection, all of our standards of food hygiene, and open up our public service contracts to being literally exploited mercilessly by unethical American firms. Is that what you want? It's not just the chlorinated chicken that we would get. It's also all of our NHS contracts that would be opened up too. So when you get into the facts again, the reason that we're in the EU at the beginning was because of trade. We have completely free trade and more because of the single market with our 28 nearest neighbours. First rule of trade economics, trade halves as distance doubles, which is why half our trade is with the EU. It's why we have more trade with the Republic of Ireland than China, because we have a 250-mile land border with Ireland, and it's our nearest neighbour, whereas China is a long way away. And they have no answer to these things at all. Do you remember that Donald Tusk, and we love Donald Tusk, I think he's absolutely magnificent, he's my favourite European leader. Do you remember he said that there was a special place in hell for the Brexiters?
He did.
Well, I have to make a confession. I'm a member of the Church of England, so I don't believe in hell. I don't actually necessarily believe in anything at all.
No.
But if there is hell, it is definitely true that the first people who should go into it, in the inner and hottest circle of it, should be Rees-Mogg, Johnson and Farage. They should be the first ones to be admitted and should spend the longest time. However, I am told that my good friend Liam Fox is very keen on hell.
Yes, he is.
He has been to visit it several times and has a good working relationship with it because he's trying to negotiate a trade deal with it at the moment. Because he's been unable to negotiate a trade deal with anyone else and apparently has very high spending power and it's extremely amenable to having a deal. But of course it's total fantasy. And then let me come to the third one. I could go on down the list of all these issues as to why this whole thing is completely farcical. But this issue of the money. Now the money is absolutely central to the Brexiters' argument. And it's part of the reason why, by the way, why I'm convinced that we'll win a second referendum, because the money really matters. The bus, 350 million a week for the NHS, and people don't carry in their minds, when they're dealing with very large numbers, quite what these numbers mean. It seemed like we were going to be able to double spending on the NHS if we left the EU. People thought that there was this shed loads of money that were going from this country to the EU, and if we left, those shed loads of money would all come back, and we'd be able to sort out our social care crisis and the funding of the NHS and build new hospitals and have more GPs and all of that. What actually happened, of course, as soon as we started negotiating with the EU, is that far from us getting 350 million a week from them, alongside the Irish backstop, Theresa May had to agree to pay the EU 39 billion as a divorce deal. And the 39 billion covers all of the debts that we'll have when we leave the EU, including the pensions of tens of thousands of people who worked in the European institutions. It's all the money we have to pay for half-built infrastructure projects, on the European Social Fund and all of that, which of course we've got to see through over the next year. It's all of the farm payments going to our farmers for the whole of the implementation period and probably beyond that. And it's the fee that we've agreed to pay in order to have continued access to the customs union and the single market for at least the first few years and probably beyond that. There was no way we can get away without doing that. Now, of course, as soon as that was agreed, Rees-Mogg, Farage, Johnson all said this was an outrage that we were giving this 39 billion to the EU, an absolute outrage, and we shouldn't be paying it. Johnson said we should pay a lot less, and Farage, when I kept on him on this, when I was on his programme, said we should be paying them nothing like the 39 billion, he said. So I said to him, well, Nigel, how much should we pay them? You don't like the 39 billion, so what is it going to be? Is it going to be 10 billion, 20 billion, 25 billion? I mean, make it a game of bingo. And then we can work out which bits we're getting, which bits we're not getting, whether our farmers are going to be left homeless or whether it's just the people who've got EU pensions. What is it that's going to happen? And of course, he resolutely refused to answer. He just said, a lot less. We shouldn't be paying them anything like the sum that Theresa May is proposing. And when I was doing one of these phone-ins, and I'd had this thing with him, and we got to this point, which we always get to in these discussions, somebody phoned in, and unusually, they hadn't been weeded out because they weren't a Brexiter, which is what normally happens in these programmes. They somehow got through the switchboard, and they said, Mr. Farage, this caller said, Mr. Farage, you should answer Lord Adonis's question. How much are you going to give those Europeans? How much? We want a figure. Now, somewhat thrown by that, Farage answered the question. He said, I tell you, sir, how much we should give those Europeans. A nice round number, nothing, he said. So I said, Nigel, that's great. At long last, we know what your deal is going to be with Mr. Juncker. You're going to give him nothing. I said, but Nigel, it can't be literally nothing, I said. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, there's this little matter of your pension.
Yep.
I said.
Absolutely.
Because he's got
16 years.
He's got a pension. He's been in the European Parliament, which he barely turns up to and spends all his time attacking. But he's got a pension of £73,000 a year because he's been there for 20 years. He is our longest-serving member of the European Parliament. Oh. He's got this pension. Now, I said, Nigel, because you have to keep him factual in order to really rile him. I said, Nigel, you could choose not to draw your pension. I said, you have an opportunity to tell the British people on air now that you're not going to draw it. I said, are you going to give up your pension? Because we've got this big black hole of the 350 million a week we're supposed to be giving to the NHS. You could make your own unique contribution to it. There was silence on the microphone. The only time I ever silenced. I said, well, Nigel, since it appears that you want your pension, I said, I will make it my personal responsibility to negotiate at least your pension with Juncker and Barnier, I said. And so we need to work out, Nigel, let's stress about it now, how many years you intend to live. This is hugely important to negotiating the pension. I said, you're my age, is 56. I said, so you'll be retiring in 8 or 9 years' time. I said, you could have 20 or 30 years. I said, you want to come to the House of Lords. I said, and I know the House of Lords, there is good epidemiological research which shows that membership of the House of Lords adds about 10 years to your life expectancy. It is the best form of nursing care that's ever been invented in human history. I mean, as somebody put it to me when I arrived, they pay you to have lunch each day, and they take what you say. Sorry, it's a very, very important part of our working of our constitution. But anyway, so he could be there. I said, Nigel, you could be there for 40 years, I said. So we could need to negotiate a pension of £5 or £6 million for you. I said, now I'm prepared to go into bat for your pension. I said, it's particularly important we do, because we know that we don't want you to be a burden on the state, I said, in your old age, because you know what his views are on all of those sorts of issues. And I said, there's another reason. In my previous exchanges with Farage, I had ascertained that his kids, who are in their 20s, have German passports. And I, by the way, don't begrudge them their German passports. I said that I wanted all of Britain's young people to have German passports too. So maybe he could adopt them all, so they could all have them. You can imagine how that one went down. I said, but Nigel, now that we know your kids are going to be living in Germany when you're retired, it's all the more important we agree your pension, so there's somebody who's going to be looking after you over here. So the conversation degenerated quite quickly. But you get the point, don't you? It is massive, flagrant hypocrisy. He seems to want everyone else to have their living standards sacrificed apart from him, and the issue of his pension can be replicated hundreds of thousands of times in other people whose livelihoods depend upon us having an exit deal with the EU which actually settles our debts. And we're Britain, we don't walk away from our debts and so on. I could go down the list of issues and why there's this flagrant hypocrisy. But where we're at now, just to bring my remarks together, is that the Brexit proposition has essentially disintegrated. None of the promises made 3 years ago can be delivered. In my view, they never could be delivered. They were always fantasy. And the process of negotiating to negotiate a deal exposed the fact they couldn't be delivered. Theresa May did her best to negotiate, but the deal that she got just lost both sides. People like us who are in favour of staying in the EU said, look, this deal is so bad, it's so much worse than what people were promised 3 years ago. The right thing to do now is to put it to the people and see whether they really want it. But of course the Brexiters, realising that it meant the betrayal of all of the promises that they'd made 3 years ago, or in the case of Farage, just a straightforward power play because he wanted to move against the Tories anyway, because he got the proposals of his new party set up and all of that, they came out against it too. So she lost both sides, which is the reason why her deal went down the first time by a majority of 250 in the House of Commons, which is the largest majority any major government proposition has gone down by in Parliament since the English Civil War. It's why the second time it went down by 150, and it's why the third time it went down by 60. And that's when Johnson and Rees-Mogg, both of whom had said that this was the worst thing that had ever happened in the history of our country, both of them, remember, voted for it the third time round, which is part of the reason why I'm absolutely confident Boris will have no problem at all with us ultimately remaining in the EU. He says both sides of everything the whole time, including Theresa May's deal. And the only deal he's going to be able to put to Parliament anyway is a new version of Theresa May's deal, because there's going to be no substantive negotiation. So the lies have been exposed. We can see the deal. It's not what was on offer 3 years ago. And the right thing that should now happen, very, very clearly, is that her deal, or his deal, if he adopts it again, should now just go to a referendum with an option to remain. And it's, as Sherlock Holmes famously put it in the end of A Study in Scarlet, but he used it at the end of several of his stories, the reason why I think we will get to a referendum, and the reason why we should not give up and we should keep campaigning, is that once you have eliminated the impossible, Watson, you are just left with the improbable, which must be the truth. And we have eliminated the impossible. We've eliminated no deal. There was a majority of 250 against that in the House of Commons last time it was put to the vote. It doesn't matter that Boris says that's what he would do. We're a parliamentary democracy. Parliament would have to vote for it. And I can tell you, Parliament is not voting for no deal. It's not voting to destroy the livelihoods of millions of people and put our whole international legal status in jeopardy. So it's not, no deal's not happening. Theresa May's deal isn't happening. Canada plus, all these fantasy things, they're not happening either. So what you're left with by a process of elimination is a referendum. Just possibly an election. But since an election isn't going to resolve anything, because you've got 3 Conservative parties, a Brexit party and 2 Labour parties out there at the moment, you are not going to be able to get a majority for anything coming out of elections. So the thing that would follow, in my view, from an election, whatever the balance between the parties, is deadlock in Parliament again and a requirement for a referendum. So we might as well get there sooner rather than later. And the sooner we hold this referendum and put our national politics out of the misery it's in at the moment, the better. That is the blunt truth facing the country. And when we get that referendum, the 4 big reasons why we should be campaigning in the way that we've been so resolutely over the last year to stay in the EU are very, very straightforward. Reason 1, to protect our trade and jobs. The only good deal that keeps our trade and jobs in prosperity is staying in the EU. Any form of Brexit trashes our economy to a greater or lesser degree. Everyone now accepts that. The Governor of the Bank of England says it all the time. It's now absolute received wisdom. And you can see what's happening to the investment. It might have been an isolated case when Nissan first announced it wasn't putting further investment into Sunderland. But once you've got Nissan, BMW, Honda, Hitachi, a whole succession of big inward investors into this country, all saying it, it's not a coincidence. It's clearly a strategic decision that's being taken because Britain is no longer a safe haven for investment. So for trade and jobs, the best thing to do is to stay in the EU. To avoid a hard border in Ireland, what is the right thing to do? No form of Brexit, stay in the EU. For our young people and their ability to forge careers and make their lives over the next generation, what's the best thing to do? Stay in the European Union. Because a student put it to me when I was lecturing at another university recently, and I explained what was going to be involved, visas and work permits and all of that. They said, I now get it. What you're saying this Brexit thing is that we're going to be shut up on a small island with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson.
Not fair.
And that's true, we will be. None of us want that fate for us or for our children or our grandchildren. And the fourth reason, which to my mind has always been the most significant reason why we should fight to stay in the EU, but we didn't talk about it enough 3 years ago, but we need to start talking about it more, is that the European Union is the best peace project that we've got in Europe. Indeed, it's not only the best peace project, it's in many ways the only peace project there's ever been in Europe. In the 1,000 years, when Europe as we now know it, in terms of the tribes and now nations that inhabit Europe are there, in the 1,000 years, going back to before the Norman conquest, the only 70 consecutive years when there hasn't been war between major tribes or states in Europe is the last 70 years. The 70 years when we've had both NATO and the European Union bringing together the major European states, indeed virtually all European states now, as a club of democracies committed to peace and prosperity. It works, but it works in a dangerous world where we have Trump to our west and where we have Putin to our east. And Putin is a fascist dictator straight out of the 1930s who has already invaded one European country, Ukraine, has occupied half of it, has massive troops on the borders of 3 other European states, the 3 Baltic states, and could at any time invade. So what is the right thing to do, faced with massive threats to our security and faced with a set of institutions which have maintained the peace? It is, of course, to stay in those institutions, and as Gordon Brown put it in by far the best of the videos that was done in the last referendum campaign on the Remain side, where he did that brilliant video walking through the ruins of Coventry Cathedral. We should never want this to happen again, and what we should be doing in Britain is leading and not leaving. And this, if I can just do a last-minute plug for my book, and I'm signing copies afterwards, and all the proceeds go to great European causes. Actually, there are 2 books. There's my book on why we shouldn't be Brexiting, and my book on Prime Ministers in Europe since the war, which is called Half In, Half Out, which sort of sums up the whole problem. But when I was looking back at the history of it, this idea that somehow it all started just as an organisation about markets and trade, and had nothing to do with pooling sovereignty and seeking to see that we brought the fundamental policies and the fundamental values of our European states together. This is complete nonsense, and you just need to go back to look at the founding treaties of the European Union to realise it.